it is a departure from things that I've done in the past where I have to stay a little closer to some sense of realism. Here, you can be a lot more wild with the color and really kind of cut loose, but I feel like there's also a risk in that, and that you can kind of go too far, include too many colors in the frame, and just create a palette that's sort of off-putting. One of my big concerns that we had so many different planets, so many different sets. You wanted each of them to have a sort of distinctive look so that you felt like when you cut back to a place you've been before, you kind of instantly knew where you were. I did a little like a map of the progression of the scenes within the episode, and sometimes that map would include stills as kind of reference frame. That informed a lot of the way we were thinking about color.
Hi, I am Chad Anderson of FilmmakerU.com, filling in for Gordon Burkell. At FilmmakerU, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. You can learn more on FilmmakerU.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week, we are delighted to interview a film and TV professional, and this week we are pleased to be joined by cinematographer Chris Teague, whose work includes Russian Doll, Only Murders in the Building, and most recently, The Acolyte. Chris, I'm so thankful that you can join us today and answer all of our questions. I appreciate you being here and taking the time. I first want to ask about light and color in a show like The Acolyte. From my perspective, this isn't like a typical sitcom or suburban living room show. There's lots of color and lots of lights coming from lots of different places. There are diodes and LEDs and computers and buttons and sabers that generate light themselves all over the place. How do you manage the array of colors, and when is it all too much?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is a departure from things that I've done in the past where you're lighting an apartment or, lighting a house, and you're sort of have to stay a little closer to some sense of realism. Here, you can be a lot more wild with the color and really kind of cut loose. But I feel like there's also a risk in that, and that you can kind of go too far, include too many colors in the frame, and just create a palette that's sort of off-putting. I mean, I think one of my big concerns with the show, was that we had so many different planets, so many different sets, at each, and I wanted each of them to have a sort of distinctive look, so that you felt like when you cut back to a place you've been before, you kind of instantly knew where you were. And so I did a little kind of like a map of the progression of the scenes within the episode. And sometimes that map would include stills as kind of reference frames. Like in the first episode, there's the mech ship that OSHA's working on, and
Hmm.
a reference point for that ship, both in the set design and also in the cinematography of it, was the movie Aliens, which tends to skew a bit cooler, a bit sometimes green in moments. And so we were looking for a sort of a cooler green or blue industrial kind of palette,
Yeah.
in that set. So we mapped that out. We maybe put a photo from that movie, or sometimes I would just put a swatch of color. Or one of the things I really like to do is, if I'm pulling references from other films or other imagery that I like, I will just grab a square of a color that I find very like impactful, or something I just want to kind of grab and try to match to, for a particular scene. So it's and then, there's certain sets where you see the design and there's some color built into them already, like you said, with the diodes, with the blue and red buttons and things. And I think the other thing we were trying to be very conscious of, was to do something that felt like it had, even though it's very colorful, it has somewhat of a limited color palette, and that we're tending more towards kind of primary colors like blues or greens, or reds, like basic kind of colors, rather than getting into super nuanced like fuchsias and purples and things like that,
Hmm.
because we were going for something that was more like the original three Star Wars films. You know, there's that great battle sequence in Empire Strikes Back where there's it's basically just blue and orange. You know, like the backgrounds are all like the smoke from behind the set is lit orange, and then the underlight is blue, or you know, or maybe it was the other way around. But it's just like really basic, really straightforward, and really striking, I think. So you know that informed a lot of the way we were thinking about color.
I sort of got into VFX by accident. I always had a technical interest in photography, and especially as it relates to movie making. There's something magical about the ability to believe something is happening when it isn't. So I went as a live action producer into a company called Bob Abel and Associates. Then I would have to, have a meeting about how do we do this effect that's in this commercial, and I never got the straight answer I was looking for. I have camera knowledge, so it's like, since it's kind of ambiguous, why don't I just grab a camera and we'll try it out. You have to figure out what tells the story and use every trick in the book to solve your problem. I am Rob Legato, and this is my course on visual effects.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely a sense like for Coruscant has kind of always kind of a nice, pleasing. It feels like there's a light daytime talk show almost feel of like it's everything's pleasant and everything's
Yeah.
like kind of serene almost. I
Yeah.
noticed for in episode 4 and 5, Kofar, the forest planet, has a very there's a lot of cutaways to this intense kind of blood orange sun, this heavy duty sun, especially in the episode 5, which is coincidentally called Night. There's this overwhelming kind of orange, in everyone's hair, and it's there. Where did that come from?
Well, one of the things that was really exciting for me was the kind of narrative arc of episode 4. It's all about this group of Jedi going into the forest and trying to accomplish their mission before nightfall because Kofar is a planet. It becomes an incredibly dangerous place, you
Yeah.
know, when it gets dark there. So it's really this great race against time where we're using light to help kind of tell the story. And so we decided there would be sort of three main lighting sort of formulas for the progression of like late day into night. And those are kind of a combination of gels that we were using on our like kind of hard sources of light, sort of our sunlight mimicking sources. Like we had these big tungsten Wendy lights that are essentially like a big square with an array of small bulbs on them that project a really punchy, really powerful, but kind of broad beam of light. And we would gel those. We would, match the color that those created on our LED lights that we would use to kind of supplement our sunlight. And then we had the other component, which was kind of the ambient light that was on top of the set. That was usually typically our soft boxes that were just setting kind of a base level on top of the set. So, in our earlier day look, the warmth of the sunlight is really just created from dimming down the tungsten lights because they go warmer as you dim them down, and having a more of a neutral ambience in the sky and a brighter ambience in the sky. And then the second sort of look was us adding a gel called soft amber on top of the
Hmm.
Wendy's. So it's just warming up, getting things a little bit more golden. But then it's as we verge into night when things get really dangerous. We found this gel that we love. It's called Vitario Storaro Orange. There's this line of gels that Vitario Storaro sort of pioneered, and they're all in line with his style as a cinematographer, super saturated, very rich color.
Yeah.
So the Storaro Orange really read on camera more like a blood red. And so that kind of gave us this characteristic, like very last sun in the sky look that also created a feeling that was very kind of menacing. And then we paired that with an ambience that was much darker than the other two looks, but also, over 2000 degrees Kelvin higher than what we were rating the camera at, which made it, a very cool color.
Is that something that you have to consider when dealing with, the future that's going to be color correction in terms of LUTs or working that into, the ideas of what you're looking at, basically?
Well, the way, we developed a lot when we started the show, and it's was based on a Kodak film emulation LUT, and then we modified it for a few different reasons to kind of handle skin tones the way that we liked, and a little bit, we just modified the contrast ratio slightly, and also modified some kind of deeply saturated colors that were exhibiting some kind of strange artifacting. So we had this film emulation LUT, but and my experience with when you're working with LUTs, particularly ones that are based off of film, some unpredictable things can happen when you're shooting, particularly with like bright saturated colors. So it's really important to test. And I've had
Yeah,
experiences, where I look at some bright color that the LEDs are emitting that looks perhaps like very cyan to my eye, and then on camera it only looks like a pale blue. So
sure.
it's that kind of testing, that we had to do to make sure that we were getting something that would survive the post process, and that we wouldn't have to rely on kind of building it, at the end. And also, you realize like you modify one thing and it's a bit of a house of cards where you might be modifying, skin tones or other aspects of the image that you don't necessarily want to touch.
In terms of working with such a VFX heavy thing, um, how much for Kofar in episode 4 and 5, how much of that is actually there? I was trying to figure out where, location stops and where, you know,
Yeah.
background begins and set extension begins. And is it complicated as a cinematographer to work with that?
I mean, I was very fortunate on this show because we sort of took even though there's a ton of amazing VFX in the show, we tried to do as much practically as we could. And the example of Kofar, um, there's, a lot of location work that leads us to the edge of the forest. And then we shot this scene that sort of bridges the gap between location and set, where we found this place in Madeira, that was like kind of a bit of a gully, that looked like, that had a pathway going through it that looked like it could be an entry point, and then our art department brought, and it had no trees, no greens, no nothing on it. And the art department brought, rhododendrons and a lot of different actual green plants to create a sort of a barrier, and then incorporated elements of those giant trees that you see on our stage work, to create almost this kind of gateway for the actors to go through. And then as they kind of walk towards the camera through the all these greens, you cut to a reverse shot of them walking away from camera, and that's done on set. And I think like my goal was with that to, if we could get our main characters into sort of full shadow on our location set, then I could kind of start them in full shadow on our stage, and there would be some, matching. And there's matching obviously within the cut, within the movement. They're coming toward us, you cut, and they're turning, coming away from us, that all kind of worked really well. But all to say, the set, was the vast majority of it was built. We didn't do any set extensions in the forest. We did a lot of cheating where we had a pretty vast space to work with a bunch of kind of clearings, in the middle of the forest
Hmm.
set. But we would redress them constantly and cheat direct camera direction constantly to kind of make it look bigger than it was. But we were basically working with something, roughly maybe a little bit smaller than a football field, and then more than half of the edge of the set was backed with a hand painted backdrop. So the backdrop was perfectly matched with the tonalities and colors of the real forest on set, and it was broken up by the set so much, and we just lit it very minimally so that you had the impression of, you could see through our forest and you could see the backdrop if you were really looking for it, but it really felt like it was kind of receding into infinity. And I thought it was very
Yeah.
effective. Like I think I was very happy with how it turned out. And it was definitely nerve-wracking in the very beginning as we're looking at this space that is, certainly the biggest set I've ever worked on, but
Yeah.
knowing also that we need to do so much running and choreography and so much dialogue in this space that, we had to constantly kind of get clever with reimagining how we were using it.
Yeah, they're definitely big spaces there. Speaking of which, I believe from what I've read, there was some work that was done with what VFX artists are calling the volume now, which is this LED back screen. Was that used in this?
There was actually no volume work done on the Acolyte. And
Okay.
that was sort of a decision that was made early on. We talked about a few sets that might be good candidates for it. But it was partly, I think, Lucasfilm felt like that was the right approach for this show. And also in terms of the style of the show, because we were inspired by the original films, like we felt like maybe volume wasn't the right move for this show. And
Interesting.
that led to us having to be very clever with some of our sets. There were
That's
sets
interesting.
that we had to, the whole kind of snowy open landscape of Karlak was not a set that we had originally built. We had built the cave that exists in the end of episode one, that Osha kind of runs off into. But we had to use this kind of extra space on the set that was really meant to be the void off the cliff that almost Osha almost falls off, and kind of build some snow and some like landscape and some rocky, outcrops in there to kind of create something that we didn't otherwise have space to to build in this. So it was one of those solutions that sort of felt very indie film to kind of like, use a little extra space to create something that wasn't there. But our production designer, Kevin Jenkins, was so clever that way, that cave set that exists in episode one, the beginning of two, also gets reused to be the stranger's hideout, in later episodes of the show. He just kind of
Hmm.
reconfigured things, but he was very clever about building a set with the eye of being able to like transform it into something else down the line.
So from that perspective, you mentioned the influence of, Lucasfilm's ideas and directions in there. I'm thinking about the idea of taking on a Star Wars, project and, the history and the lore of Star Wars. Is there a version, a generation of Star Wars that you look at for inspiration of, oh, or this needs to be like the original series, or this needs to be, more modern than the original series, or this needs to be like, the prequels or something else that really kind of was a direction that you went into in terms of how this was shot and how this was staged?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think because I grew up in the 80s and I saw those original three films when I was a young kid. That was the aesthetic that's been kind of burned into my brain as like the kind of key essential Star Wars aesthetic. So that was, the thing that I was always aiming for, this idea of a world that feels kind of handmade, that has this mixture of both these kind of clean, futuristic spaces, but at the same time, a lot of the technology that feels like science fiction to us is not, the Rebel, like the X-Wings and things like that are all gritty. They're all covered in dust and dirt and grime, and I always love that
Hmm.
about those movies, how it wasn't the whole world wasn't this kind of pristine space, and that was something that we definitely felt inspired by. But then on the other hand, there are sets like. There's aspects of the Mechneck ship that are very closely related to sets that were designed in the prequel films, and so we kind of had to go and reference those and try to build a look there that was, still fit, I think, the look of our show a little bit better, but wasn't so much a departure from the prequels that it would feel like we were kind of changing things drastically. Same thing with Coruscant. Coruscant's appeared in many films and shows, and so there was definitely a need to feel like we were like being faithful to what had been established. But I think with ours, we might have like gone a little bit more golden and a little bit more kind of contrast
Yeah.
in our sunlight effect.
I imagine it must be challenging, or as a kid growing up, myself as well, as a kid growing up with Star Wars, with getting the canon right, because there's going to be a bunch of nerdy fans who are judgmental of everything that
Yeah.
happens. Yeah, I want to talk about in a couple different places in episodes you shot, particularly the original one I thought of was episode one, was fight sequences. You talked about referencing aliens and that kind of look and that kind of thing. Maybe because it was Carrie Ann Moss, and maybe because of that, but the opening fight sequence, I immediately thought of Matrix. How how much time does it take to shoot a fight sequence like that with so many angles and so many close-ups and so many movements and choreography? And how do you work with a fight choreographer to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean that sequence took I mean, the entire scene, which has dialogue and fight choreography in it, I don't know if I could put a number to it off the top of my head, but I think I would say at least 2 weeks of filming. There was main unit filming, and then there was some second unit work as well. And the process was incredible and very new to me, but it just felt like um, a very sort of cutting edge to me. The way that we did it, and I learned a lot in doing it. Where the our action designer Chris Cowan worked with our stunt coordinator Mark Ginther and our fight coordinator Lou, and they had built this incredible fight sequence that Leslie, our showrunner, had a lot of input on, and my input on it mostly came from the perspective of here's where I would hope that we would block aspects of this fight, because I think it's gonna the light is gonna look good in these positions, and I'd like to have the camera on this side of the axis of the fight versus that, and if you can kind of work with me on that, and then we'll give you all this space to play in. And what they did is they worked with their stunt performers and recorded all the fight choreography in motion capture suits on their kind of virtual set. And then we took the 3D design of the set from our production designer Kevin Jenkins, and they were basically able to skin the motion capture actors with sort of temporary but kind of like video game-esque figure skins,
Sure.
so that they weren't just like blue bodies in space, and put them within the 3D model. And then Chris and I could kind of walk through the virtual set with his Ronin gimbal with a monitor on it, or a kind of virtual camera, and completely plan out the
It's
shot
amazing.
scene. And with a click of a button, we could change a lens. With a click of a button, we can be up 10 feet high above the action, and then we can rewind the action over and over again, and really get a sense for what it's going to be like when we shoot, and know that, okay, this shot we're going to have to be on a crane because the camera is not on the ledge where the people are fighting. It needs to be out behind, like beside the ledge, or those kind of things. So it made the planning just really detailed and streamlined. And so that was such a great process. And it was a time consuming process for everybody involved, but it certainly paid off, because it felt like things cut together seamlessly. And then when it came to shooting things on set, we had this perfect reference that we could go to and, try to recreate. And then often myself and my camera operator would have a mini discussion about, okay, how can we like improve upon this in any way? And sometimes we couldn't, and it just kind of needed to be what it was. And sometimes, we would just change the movement slightly, or you see how the performer's actually doing it on the day. And it's a little bit different than how the fight choreography went, when it was being done with people in motion capture suits. So you modify it then. You go on a little bit of a longer lens, or you go a little bit lower, like these kinds of things. But to have that confidence to know like this shot's going to cut beautifully from this shot to this shot, and know that like
Sure.
you're it's amazing to some of these setups, because normally coming from working in independent film, you're trying to be as efficient as possible, and you're trying to set up a shot that covers as much of the action as possible. Well, in fight choreography, typically, the performers train in like specific segments where, they train really hard to do two kicks and a punch that look amazing. And so that's the
Sure.
shot that we need to cover. We're not going to be trying to run the whole fight, and try to cover it in a shot and maybe get lucky. It had to become like very precise. And that was also the style of the photography of the film, is that the precision of the camera, it was meant to match the kind of precision of the martial arts choreography.
Probably one of the smartest things I've ever done for my career. He gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to jump into a new career.
Getting myself into a mindset, thinking like an editor, and being around people that I can talk to on that level was really invaluable to me.
A lot of the things that I learned from that class, I still think about.
I loved the classroom. I loved the computer stations. We built a sense of community.
And it also instills a lot of confidence in you to take that and go out into the world.
After I took the class, I felt very prepared to take the next step.
I owe Manhattan Workshop the career that I have right now.
Things have been going great, and I really have the Manhattan Workshop to thank for that.
Yeah, I think it's great that it's almost like a 21st century, storyboards where you had original, pencil drawings doing all the work for you, and now it's, hey, you can set up a whole scene virtually in kind of this previs world, and do it. And so yeah, it looked really amazing. So I was like trying to think of like, God, that must have been a ton of work to do. I want to ask about something strange or silly, I guess. I always think about the challenges of, snow and smoke and fog and sparks and those kind of live elements in a scene. And again, different than say something like Only Murders in This Building. This has a lot of stuff going on, so it's almost like the LED lights. It's a whole nother element of fire and these kind of natural elements that exist in there. How challenging is it to choreograph those things?
It can be challenging. It's about, I think, knowing the parameters of the tool that you're working with. And I think primarily what you're talking about is like special effects, basically. And you know, uh, atmosphere behaves in interesting ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can, in certain conditions, it can just sit along the ground. In certain conditions, it dissipates really quickly. Certain positions, in certain conditions, it builds up, and then you have to let it kind of dissipate because, you're always trying to maintain a consistency. That's honestly one of the most challenging things. When you're dealing with atmosphere, for me, is you've gotten all your lighting right and you're about ready to roll camera and then you realize, oh, there's all the atmosphere's gone. It's not anywhere close to where it was the shot that we just did. And so it's just this almost kind of like this living being that you have to kind of constantly pay attention to. But it gives such a great, it can give such a great quality to the lighting and great
Yeah.
to the image. I think it's definitely worth it. And particularly for like Karlak, that snowy planet where we did have
Yeah.
this much smaller set than we would have wanted to work with. We built a look in that was very heavy on atmosphere, very heavy on snow, and sort of underexposed and dim with the idea that like the cloud cover is so intense on this planet that it's never really bright, and you
Mm-hmm.
never really get much very strong light in the sky. And hopefully we can kind of cheat the eye with all of these special effects to kind of make the audience assume that there's more depth than there really is in the space. And we had like luckily some help from visual effects to give us, some extensions in certain shots to make us, feel like the world was bigger or wrapping around the corner of a certain rock or something like that. So, I think like any department, it's like trying to be in constant communication and ask the right questions about, okay, how does this work? How long does it take to set up? When do I need to tell you like where I need to see this in frame? Same thing with sparks. Sparks take a few minutes to set up, and there's safety involved with those, so, you want them to really sell on camera. You don't want to place them where they're not going to play. And so it's about being very communicative about where the best place to see them might be and what the best timing might be for them to go off, things like that. So it's just a lot about constant communication.
Yeah, it is kind of like these natural effects are kind of like unreliable actors in the scene. You almost have to hope that they're going to make their mark and hit their line and perform the way you want them to.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I want just one more thing on that. This is kind of funny is that, we created this kind of cloud effect on the Kofar set. So it was like this really intense fog that would hang up in the sky. And it was incredible when we first did it because it was about like keeping the temperature up in the ceiling really hot and really cold below the stage. And so the first, week or so we were shooting with it, it was working beautifully and hanging like a cloud in the sky. And then the temperature shifted. And we didn't have that. It was much harder to create that kind of temperature differential because like it was getting warmer in England where we were filming. And so we create this cloud, and instead of having it hang up in the sky for, 2 hours, it would hang up there for 30 minutes. And then suddenly you just see it kind of drop down onto our set, and we'd have to just kind of pull open the doors and let the whole set kind of air out for a while and kind of start over, basically.
you got to fire them and hire another cloud coverage.
Yeah.
The last question I want to ask you, Chris, do you have a guilty pleasure, something that you watch, TV or movies, for fun to just kind of let loose or maybe unplug your brain after a long day of work? Um,
Yeah, I think my like unplug my brain. I just love to laugh, and I love to go and watch SNL sketches on YouTube. Basically, I think that's my guilty pleasure. I just go. Lately, I've been watching, all the cold opens or the most recent sketches. But I mean, I'm such a big fan of classic SNL, so I'll go back and watch old, Steve Martin or Eddie Murphy or Jim Belushi set sketches, or just like the classic ones that I watched when I was a kid, because I get that kind of like nostalgia kick from watching all that stuff. I just love it so much. And yeah, I appreciate what a good comedian can do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good time. Yeah. Of course, I'll get lost in those YouTube clips and then be an hour late to work or something because I'll be
Yeah,
watching one after another. So you got to be careful.
absolutely. Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for talking to us today. I
All
really
right.
appreciate it. It was an exciting show, and it's really interesting to watch from a viewer's perspective. What's going on, and think about the things that you're thinking about. So a chance to tap into your brain is a reward for us.
Cool. Well, thanks for all the great questions. It was fun talking.
Absolutely. That's going to be it for us this week. You can check us out on filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_you. I am Chad Anderson. Thank you so much for watching. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you.